A millionaire pays a homeless woman to be his wife for 9 months and have a child. But when the baby was born, he was shocked by what happened. Before the story begins, comment below which city you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Richard Foster stood at the busy downtown intersection, his thoughts consumed by a single idea: finding someone who could help him solve his problem without complications. That's when he saw her. Julia, sitting in the corner of the sidewalk, clutching an old, tattered coat against the cold. Her hair was disheveled, but her eyes held something that caught Richard's attention, a mix of wounded pride and silent determination, even amidst the misery. Richard didn't hesitate. He walked toward her, his commanding presence drawing the attention of people around them. He stopped in front of Julia and crouched slightly, trying not to seem intimidating. "Hello, my name is Richard Foster. I have a proposal for you," he said, his voice firm yet controlled. Julia looked up, wary. Proposals usually didn't mean anything good for someone in her position. "I'm not interested in charity," she replied bluntly. Richard smirked slightly, finding her boldness intriguing. "It's not charity, it's work, and if you accept, you'll have a place to live, food, and a good amount of money when it's all over." Julia narrowed her eyes, still skeptical. "What kind of work?" "I need you to be my wife for 9 months." The statement landed like a bombshell. Julia laughed in disbelief, but Richard's serious expression didn't waver. He briefly explained that the marriage would be a facade, with clear terms. In return, Julia would receive an amount that would change her life forever. After several minutes of silence and hesitation, Julia agreed. Her need outweighed her pride at that moment. "All right, but I want everything in writing," she said, trying to show that despite her situation, she wouldn't be easily fooled. Richard nodded and gestured for her to follow him. He took her straight to a private clinic without clearly explaining why. At the clinic, Julia underwent a series of exams. The doctor, a middle-aged man who seemed to have known Richard for a long time, performed the procedures carefully. Julia found it strange, but Richard reassured her, saying it was just to ensure her health, since she would soon be living in better conditions. The doctor, however, handed Richard a detailed report on Julia's health, confirming she was in good condition. Richard read it carefully, a discreet relief crossing his face. He knew his plan hinged entirely on Julia's ability to have a healthy child, but he couldn't let her discover that just yet. As they left the clinic, Julia glanced sideways at Richard. "Why all these tests? It's not like I'm a real bride." "I want to make sure you'll be fine. I can't let anything happen while we're married," he replied, avoiding her gaze. Julia felt a slight chill. Something about Richard's tone unsettled her, but she decided not to question it further for now. That night, as they moved to the next step of the agreement, Julia wondered what was really behind such a peculiar proposal. The journey to Richard's mansion felt like a trip to another world for Julia. With every mile, the simple buildings and city noise faded, replaced by wide, tree-lined streets surrounded by massive houses she'd only seen in movies. Julia remained silent, watching through the window, while Richard, sitting beside her, scrolled through his phone as if this were just another ordinary day. When the car finally stopped, Julia found herself in front of an imposing iron gate. As it opened, the sight of the property left her speechless. It was an enormous mansion with an elegant facade, large windows, and gardens so perfectly manicured they seemed unreal. "Welcome," Richard said, his tone almost indifferent. Julia took a deep breath, trying to process the situation. For someone who had slept on sidewalks and fought for daily meals, this felt like an unattainable reality. "This is where you live?" she asked, unable to hide her amazement. "This is where we'll live for the next 9 months, he replied with a cold smile. As they entered the house, Julia was struck by the opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung from high ceilings, marble floors reflected the light, and the furniture was so luxurious she could barely imagine its cost. She looked at Richard, trying to understand how someone could live with such extravagance without feeling the weight of it. Before she could explore further, a middle-aged woman with a serious demeanor approached. "Mr. Foster, everything is prepared as you requested," the woman said, casting a quick glance at Julia. "Thank you, Carmen. This is Julia. She'll be staying here for a while. I want you to make sure everything goes smoothly." Carmen nodded but didn't hide her curiosity. Julia felt the weight of that look, as if it was a reminder that she didn't belong there. Richard then led Julia to an enormous bedroom decorated in soft shades of white and blue. "This will be your room. I hope it meets your expectations," he said, with a slight touch of irony. Julia gave a bitter smile. "It's more than enough. It's bigger than any place I've ever lived." Richard didn't respond, but there was something in his expression that showed he was fully aware of the impact the place had on her. Shortly after, he gestured for Julia to follow him. They descended to a room where a team of people was waiting. Stylists, makeup artists, and fashion consultants, all hired to transform Julia. "What's this?" she asked, alarmed. "I need you to be presentable. We can't risk anyone questioning the authenticity of our marriage." Julia crossed her arms, feeling like an exhibit on display. "So you want me to pretend to be your perfect wife, is that it?" Richard gave a subtle smile. "I don't want you to pretend. I want you to look perfect. There's a difference." Reluctantly, Julia allowed the team to do their work. For hours, she tried on expensive outfits, had her hair styled, and underwent a complete transformation. When she finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The woman reflected back at her seemed confident, elegant, as if she belonged to this world of wealth and power. "I look like someone else," she murmured. Richard sat in a corner, silently observing. When Julia turned to him, expecting some form of approval, he simply tilted his head. "You're ready now." Those words felt hollow to Julia. As much as she was dressed like a wealthy woman, she knew it was just a mask. Even so, she couldn't deny a small spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this opportunity could truly change her life. Later, Carmen brought a tray of food to Julia's room. She hesitated before leaving, as if she wanted to say something. "Is everything all right?" Julia asked, noticing the woman's discomfort. Carmen sighed, as if choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Foster is a complicated man. He doesn't do anything without a very specific reason." Julia narrowed her eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means that if he brought you here, there's something much bigger at play. Be careful, girl." Before Julia could respond, Carmen left the room, leaving her with a mix of unease and curiosity. That night, Julia lay on the soft bed, but sleep didn't come. Her mind was full of doubts. Why did Richard need a fake marriage? What did he really want from her? And most of all, why did she feel that behind his cold facade there was something else he was hiding? Meanwhile, Richard was in his office, reviewing Julia's medical reports. He had everything he needed. She was healthy, strong, and in perfect condition to carry the heir he so desperately needed. But as he looked at the paper, he found himself thinking about Julia's gaze. There was something about her that intrigued him. She was different from anyone he had ever met. Maybe it was the fact that she wasn't afraid to challenge him, even from a disadvantaged position. Richard shook his head, pushing those thoughts aside. He couldn't afford distractions. The plan was in motion, and he needed to ensure that nothing went off track. The new day at Richard's mansion began at a brisk pace. Julia was awakened by a knock on the door. Carmen, punctual and direct as always, entered with a breakfast tray and a restrained smile. "Mr. Foster asked that you be ready in an hour. He has some commitments and wants to take you along." Julia found the request odd, but didn't allow herself the luxury of refusing. She didn't yet know her place in this strange scenario, but she was determined to make every penny of the contract count. After getting ready, Julia found Richard in the mansion's grand foyer. He was impeccably dressed in a gray suit that seemed tailored to highlight his authoritative posture. He gave her a quick glance, as if assessing something he had purchased. "Shall we?" he said, opening the door for her to get into the car. During the ride, Julia tried to start a conversation, but Richard seemed lost in thought. He was focused on the next step of his plan. Although he admired Julia's fearless personality, he couldn't let it interfere. For him, this was still just a business arrangement. The car stopped in front of another private clinic, smaller and more discreet than the previous one. Julia frowned. "More tests? I thought we were done with that." Richard didn't look at her, but his voice was calm and controlled. "I need to make sure everything is perfect. We can't risk complications." Julia didn't understand why he was so cautious, but followed the doctor, waiting for her in the reception area. He was a soft-spoken man, but his questions were precise and meticulous. Julia started to feel like an object being evaluated. While she was in the examination room, Richard waited in the lounge. The doctor soon appeared with an envelope and handed it to him. "The results are excellent. She's in perfect health." Richard nodded, though a slight tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Even though everything was going according to plan, something unsettled him. Perhaps it was the fact that Julia, with her strength and intelligence, seemed far more than he had imagined when choosing a convenient wife. When Julia came out of the room, she looked at Richard with a mix of curiosity and irritation. They asked strange questions. "Is that normal?" Richard shrugged, maintaining his impassive tone. "Doctors are thorough. Don't worry about it." She crossed her arms, suspicious, but decided not to press further, for now. Later, Julia began exploring the mansion more. It was hard to believe that such a luxurious world was real. Every detail, from the paintings on the walls to the Persian rugs in the hallways, seemed to scream exclusivity. Yet, despite it all, she felt there was something artificial about the environment. While wandering, she passed a room where Richard was on the phone. She stopped inadvertently upon hearing his serious tone. "I want every step of the plan aligned. We can't afford mistakes." Julia tilted her head, trying to hear more, but Richard noticed her presence and quickly closed the door. She felt a chill down her spine. What was he planning? Later, during dinner, Julia tried to bring up the subject casually. "You always seem so busy. Is it some big deal you're working on?" Richard smiled calculatedly. "My work is full of responsibilities, but that's nothing for you to worry about." Julia knew he was deflecting. He was good at it. But at the same time, she sensed there was something deeper to Richard, something he didn't let anyone see. After dinner, Julia went to her room, but sleep didn't come. There was something about the way Richard treated her that didn't make sense. He was attentive but distant. At times he seemed to care about her, but then he'd quickly retreat behind his usual coldness. She decided she needed to find out more about him. The next morning, while Richard was in a meeting, Julia went to his office. The door was unlocked and she carefully stepped inside. The room was vast, with shelves full of books and a large wooden desk at its center. Julia began looking around, searching for something that could help her understand the man she had married. That's when she noticed a partially open drawer. Inside, there was a folder with her name on it. She hesitated for a moment but gave in to her curiosity. Opening the folder, she found medical reports and detailed notes. Julia was shocked to realize that all the tests she had undergone had been ordered even before she agreed to the contract. "What are you doing?" Richard's voice made her freeze. He stood at the door, arms crossed, his expression serious. I was looking for answers," she replied, trying to hide the folder. Richard stepped into the room and took the folder from her hands. "You're right to want answers, but not like this." Julia crossed her arms, facing him. "Then tell me the truth. Why so many tests? Why do you need me?" Richard took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't tell her everything, but he didn't want to push her away completely either. "I have my reasons, Julia, and believe me, none of them involve hurting you." But his words weren't enough to ease her doubts. Julia left the room, feeling manipulated, but also realizing that Richard was hiding something far more than just business. As she walked away, Richard looked down at the folder in his hands. He knew he was losing control of the situation, and for the first time, he started to wonder if involving Julia in his plan had been a mistake. The next day, silence hung heavily over the mansion after the argument in the office. Julia couldn't shake what she had seen in the folder, nor Richard's evasive words. She felt she needed to uncover the mystery before it was too late. Richard was restless too. He knew he was losing control of the situation. Despite his cold and calculated demeanor, there was something about Julia that disarmed him, her determination, her inner strength. These traits intrigued him and were beginning to shake the foundations of his plan. That morning, Julia decided to leave the mansion for a while. She needed a moment to herself, away from the suffocating opulence and the lies she felt surrounded her. After a brief conversation with Carmen, she was granted permission to walk in the garden. Vast and meticulously maintained, it felt to Julia like a prison disguised as paradise. As she walked, she found a small bench near a fountain. She sat down and let her thoughts flow. What did she really know about Richard? He was powerful, mysterious, and clearly carried more secrets than he was willing to share. But what about herself? What did he know about her? Why was he so interested in her medical tests? Meanwhile, Richard sat in his office, immersed in documents and reports from his private investigator. He had hired the best to uncover everything about Julia before making his proposal. But as he flipped through the papers, he realized her story was far more tragic and complex than he had imagined. Julia had lived on the streets for the past few years, but it hadn't always been that way. According to the report, her family had been humble, and everything changed when her parents lost the little they had in a financial disaster that wiped out their savings. Not long after, a car accident took their lives, leaving Julia alone and without support. Richard felt a weight in his chest as he finished reading the report. He was a man used to dealing with numbers and business, but there was something deeply human about her story that unsettled him. For the first time, he questioned whether the plan he had in mind was fair, considering everything Julia had already endured. Later that day, Richard found Julia in the mansion's library. She was sitting in an armchair, reading one of the many books on the shelves. When she saw him enter, she closed the book and looked at him with curiosity. "You seem deep in thought," she remarked, noticing the unusual expression on his face. Richard hesitated for a moment before replying, "I've been thinking about how you ended up on the streets. I want to understand your story, Julia. I want to know everything that happened." Julia frowned. It was rare for anyone to care about her past, and the idea of sharing her pain made her uncomfortable. "Why do you want to know?" "It doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything," she said, looking away. Richard took a step closer, his voice softer than usual. "It matters to me. I want to know who you really are." Julia took a deep breath, fighting the urge to retreat, but something in his tone convinced her. She began to speak, at first hesitantly, as if afraid to relive the memories. "I had a simple but happy life. My parents were hardworking. We didn't have much, but we never went hungry. Everything changed when they lost what little we had. It was a financial blow that wiped out our savings." Richard remained silent, hanging on to her every word. They tried to recover, but things only got worse. And then, the accident happened. A truck collided with their car. I didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. Julia's voice trembled, and she clasped her hands in her lap, as if trying to hold back tears. "After that, I was alone. I tried finding jobs, but no one would hire me. I didn't have experience, and I was too young." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "And I ended up being evicted because I couldn't pay rent. And then? Well, I ended up on the streets." She lowered her head, tears finally streaming down her face. "I lived off scraps and handouts for years, and no one cares who you are or where you came from when you're like that. People look at you differently when you have nothing left. It's like you're invisible." Richard felt a lump in his throat as he listened. Seeing Julia, who had always shown such strength, crumble in front of him, affected him in ways he hadn't expected. "Julia," he said, kneeling to meet her at eye level. She tried to wipe away her tears quickly, but Richard wouldn't let her. He embraced her, disregarding the usual distance he kept between them. "I'm so sorry for everything you've been through," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Julia remained still for a moment, surprised by the gesture. Slowly, she relaxed into the embrace. As much as she tried to be strong, she realized she needed that comfort. I just wanted a chance to start over," she murmured, still crying. "You deserve so much more than that," Richard replied, his tone firm, surprising even himself. For a few minutes, they stayed there in silence. Richard held her gently, as if afraid she might break. When Julia finally pulled away, something in her expression had changed. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice weak but filled with gratitude. Richard nodded, though he knew words weren't enough. He needed to do more for Julia, even if it meant questioning his own plans. Let's have some fun with those who only read the comments. Type milkshake in the comments. Only those who made it this far will understand. Now, let's continue the story. In the days following their conversation about Julia's past, something began to shift in the dynamic between her and Richard. What was once purely a contractual relationship started to take on new dimensions. He was more present, more attentive, and Julia, though still wary, began to notice that there was more to the cold and calculating man than met the eye. That morning, Julia was in the garden, tending to the flowers, which Carmen had remarked had never received so much care. It was an activity that brought Julia a bit of peace amid the chaos her life had become. Richard watched her from the veranda, his gaze distant. Carmen approached him, carrying a tray with coffee. "You've been different lately," she commented with the ease of someone who had known him for years. "Different how?" Richard asked without taking his eyes off Julia. "I don't know, more human perhaps." He smirked slightly, almost imperceptibly. "That sounds like an insult, Carmen." "It's not. I'm just saying that Miss Julia seems to have stirred something in you that you've kept locked away for a long time." Richard didn't respond, but Carmen's words lingered as he descended the steps to join Julia. When she saw him approaching, Julia stood, wiping her hands on the apron Carmen had insisted she wear. "I didn't know you liked flowers," Richard said casually. "I don't know if I like them," she replied with a shrug. "I just think it's good to do something useful." He laughed, a rare and genuine sound. "That's more than I've ever done for this garden. Carmen always said it was just for appearances." Julia raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Everything there seems to be for appearances, including you." Richard was taken aback by her bluntness, but wasn't offended. On the contrary, he admired how Julia spoke her mind, even knowing he was a powerful man. "Maybe you're right," he admitted. "But appearances often hide more than they reveal." Julia smiled but didn't reply. She knew Richard was trying to open up, but she also knew he had a habit of only sharing what he wanted others to know. That afternoon, Richard decided to take her out of the mansion. He rarely did so, but he felt it was time to show her there was a world beyond the walls of his home. "We're going out," he announced as Julia finished her lunch. "Out? Where?" she asked, skeptical. "Just trust me this time." Though reluctant, Julia agreed. They got into the car, and Richard drove to a quiet park in the city. It was a secluded spot, far from the urban chaos, with tall trees and benches scattered along well-maintained trails. Julia was surprised. She hadn't expected something so simple from Richard. "Why here?" she asked, looking around. "I thought you might like a place where you could breathe," he replied. They walked in silence for a few minutes until they reached a small lake. The reflection of the trees on the water gave the place a sense of peace Julia hadn't felt in a long time. "This is beautiful," she admitted, breaking the silence. Richard looked at her, noticing the vulnerability in her words. "You deserve beautiful things too, Julia." She turned to him, surprised by his sincerity. It was rare to hear something like that from him. But before she could respond, Richard looked away, clearly uncomfortable. After some time, they sat on a bench near the lake. Julia began sharing small stories from her childhood, happy memories that contrasted with the difficult years that followed. Richard, in turn, listened intently, something Julia never expected from someone like him. "And you?" she asked suddenly. "What was your childhood like?" Richard was silent for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "My childhood was lonely. My parents were busy people. I had everything money could buy, but I almost never had company." Julia noticed the bitterness in his voice, and for the first time, she saw Richard as someone who also carried invisible scars. "I guess, in the end, we're all just trying to overcome something," she said with a sad smile. Richard nodded silently in agreement. On the way back to the mansion, Julia couldn't stop thinking about how different the outing had been. For the first time, she felt there was a genuine connection between them, something beyond the contract. When they arrived, Richard stopped the car and looked at her for a few seconds before speaking. "Julia, I know there's a lot about me that you don't understand, but I want you to know that you're not alone here." Her heart raced. As much as she wanted to keep her emotional distance, his words touched her in an unexpected way. "Thank you," she replied, lowering her gaze. That night, while Julia was in her room, reflecting on everything that had happened, Richard sat in his office, contemplating his own actions. He knew he was getting more involved than he should, but for some reason, he couldn't stop himself. Julia had awakened something in him, something he thought he had lost long ago. In the days following the outing to the park, Julia felt that something had shifted. Richard seemed more present, but still maintained that invisible barrier that made him so hard to decipher. As she explored more of the house and garden, she discovered a small room on the lower floor that seemed to be an old office. It was simple, with worn furniture, unlike the opulence of the rest of the house. Curious, Julia began examining the objects she found there. There were old papers and an unlocked drawer with documents. Though she hesitated to go through Richard's things, her curiosity got the better of her. When she opened the drawer, she found a folder labeled with her name. Her heart raced. Why would he have a folder with her name on it? With trembling hands, she opened the file and began to read. Inside were detailed reports about her health, a timeline of her recent life, and even information about her time on the streets. The more she read, the more invaded she felt. He had known everything about her before they had even met. However, what shocked her most was finding medical records from tests she didn't know had been ordered. She remembered the recent consultations and how strange she had found the level of detail in the questions. Now, it all made sense. He wanted something more than just a sham marriage. But what? Julia lost track of time until she heard firm footsteps approaching. Richard entered the room, stopping abruptly when he saw her holding the papers. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low but tense. Julia faced him, her face red with anger. "You owe me an explanation," she said, holding up the folder. "What is this? Why do you have my entire life documented here? And these tests, what were they for?" Richard closed the door behind him and let out a long sigh. He knew this moment would come, but he hadn't expected it so soon. He walked toward her slowly, keeping his composure. "Julia, I can explain." "Then explain," she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. Richard hesitated. He couldn't reveal the entire plan, not yet, but he also didn't want to lose the little trust he had managed to build. "When I decided to make the proposal, I needed to ensure that you were the right person for what I needed," he began carefully. "The medical tests were a way to confirm that you were healthy. It wasn't personal, it was professional." Julia stared at him, incredulous. "Professional? How can you say that? You're treating my life like it's a business transaction." "And isn't it?" he replied, his voice harsher than he intended. "We have a contract, Julia. You agreed to this." She stepped back, feeling his words hit her like a blow. "I agreed because I had no choice," she shouted. "You knew that. You knew I was desperate, and you used it against me." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to contain his frustration. "I didn't want it to be this way, but it's complicated." "Complicated?" Julia laughed bitterly. "You have no idea what complicated is. You don't know what it's like to lose everything, to be treated as if you're nothing." Richard opened his mouth to respond but closed it again. He knew she was right. Nothing in his privileged world compared to what Julia had endured. "Tell me the truth, Richard. Why did you really choose me?" she asked, her voice lower now, but full of emotion. He looked into her eyes, seeing the pain and anger there. He wanted to tell her everything, but knew it could destroy the plan that was still in motion. "I chose you because I thought we could help each other," he finally said. "I needed someone who could understand what it means to start over. And you needed a chance to begin again." Julia remained silent, trying to process his words. Though they sounded almost sincere, she knew there was more. With Richard, there was always more. "That's not enough for me, Richard. I need honesty. If you can't give me that, then maybe I should leave." He felt a tightness in his chest at her words. Even though he knew their marriage was temporary, the thought of Julia leaving now felt wrong. "I don't want you to go," he said, his tone softer this time. I need you here." Julia didn't reply. Instead, she handed him the folder and left the room, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He looked down at the papers in his hands, feeling a weight he couldn't explain. Later, Julia was in the garden again, trying to calm her mind. Richard's words echoed in her head, "I need you here." Why did that feel so personal? He was a practical man, someone who did everything with a purpose. So what did he really want? Meanwhile, Richard sat in his office, staring at the documents again. He knew he was treading dangerous ground. His feelings were beginning to interfere with the plan, something he had never allowed before. Julia was making him feel things he thought he had buried long ago. The tension between Julia and Richard grew with each passing day. Since discovering the folder documenting her life, Julia felt she could no longer trust him. Even so, she was trapped in a contract that seemed impossible to escape. The sense of helplessness grew, and her mind desperately sought a solution. That morning, Julia walked through the garden, trying to organize her thoughts. She felt suffocated, surrounded by secrets Richard refused to reveal. Although she had appreciated the brief moments of vulnerability he had shown, it wasn't enough. She needed to leave, to regain control of her life. "I have to figure a way out," she murmured to herself, her gaze fixed on the tall, locked gate at the edge of the property. Later, while Richard was in a meeting with his lawyer, Julia began putting her plan into action. She observed the staff's routines, noting the moments when the gate was unlocked for deliveries. She knew it would be risky, but staying there without answers was unbearable. That night, she packed a small bag with a few things she considered important. Some clothes, a book Carmen had lent her, and an old photo of her parents that Richard had framed for her. A gesture that had surprised her, but now only added to her confusion. When dawn arrived, Julia was ready. Wearing a simple dress and comfortable shoes, she waited until she heard the sound of the gate opening for a delivery. She used the distraction to move slowly, staying out of sight. But before she could cross the threshold, a firm hand grabbed her arm. "Where do you think you're going?" Richard's voice was low and steady, but it carried a sharp edge. Julia turned quickly, her heart racing. He stood there with a somber expression, but his eyes betrayed hurt. "Let me go, Richard," she said, trying to pull her arm free. "I can't stay here." "And why not?" he asked, still holding her arm. "Because you don't trust me? Because you think I'm hiding something?" "Yes," Julia burst out. "You know everything about me, but you refuse to tell me the truth. This place is beautiful, but it's a prison. I don't know what you want from me, and it's killing me." Richard took a deep breath, releasing her arm but blocking her path with his body. "You can't just leave. It's not safe." "Safe? For who?" Julia shot back, crossing her arms. "For me or for your plan?" He didn't respond immediately, and his hesitation was all Julia needed to confirm her suspicions. "That's what I thought," she said, her voice heavy with frustration. Richard ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "Julia, I know this all feels wrong, and maybe I've handled things in the worst way possible. But I can't let you go. Not now." "Why?" she asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "What do you really want from me, Richard?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite identify. I don't know how to answer that," he admitted, lowering his head for a moment. His vulnerability disarmed her, if only briefly. She had expected anger, manipulation, but not this confusing honesty. Still, she wasn't ready to give up her fight for freedom. "That's not enough for me. I need answers, Richard. And until you're honest with me, I don't see any reason to stay here." Richard took a step back, breathing deeply. "If you truly want to leave, I won't stop you, but I want you to know I care about you, far more than I should." The confession caught Julia off guard. She stood there in silence, trying to process what he had just said. "And if I stay?" she asked hesitantly. "Will you stop treating me like a contract?" Richard nodded slowly. "I'll try." Julia didn't respond immediately. She looked at the open gate, now more symbolic than functional. She had the chance to leave, but something inside her made her hesitate. Perhaps it was curiosity about what was really behind Richard's facade, or maybe it was the vulnerability he had just shown. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay, for now." Richard looked relieved, but his expression still carried something Julia couldn't decipher. Later, sitting in her room, Julia reflected on what had happened. The idea of leaving was still on her mind, but for some reason, she felt it wasn't the right time. There was something about Richard that intrigued her, something she wanted to understand before making a final decision. Meanwhile, Richard was in his office, staring out the window at the gate. He knew he was lucky that Julia had stayed, but he also knew he needed to change his approach. If he continued hiding the truth, she wouldn't stay for long. Julia's unease grew with each passing day. Despite Richard's attempts to show kindness and build trust, she couldn't ignore the sense that something darker lay beneath it all. The questions in her mind piled up, making it impossible to relax or trust him fully. That afternoon, Julia decided she needed answers. As she walked through the corridors, her eyes landed on Richard's bedroom door. It was closed, but not locked. He had left for a business meeting, and his absence seemed like the perfect opportunity to investigate. With hesitant steps, she pushed the door open and entered the room. It was elegant and orderly, with dark wood furniture and impeccably arranged decor. Everything about the space seemed to reflect Richard's control and pragmatism. As her eyes scanned the room, a black folder on a nearby cabinet caught her attention. The folder seemed out of place, as though it had been left there in a hurry. Julia hesitated, her heart pounding at the thought of what she might find. Curiosity, however, got the better of her. She picked up the folder and opened it with trembling hands. Flipping through the first few pages, she saw medical reports. She quickly recognized them as the same tests she had undergone since arriving. But as she read further, something in her stomach twisted. These weren't just ordinary medical reports. They were detailed analyses of her reproductive health. One sentence stopped her cold. Ideal conditions for gestation confirmed. Julia brought a hand to her mouth, a mix of shock and betrayal washing over her. Now everything made sense. The medical appointments, the specific questions, Richard's insistence on monitoring her health. He hadn't chosen her by chance. To him, she wasn't a wife. She was a means to an end. As tears filled her eyes, she flipped through more pages, reading details that made her feel like an object being evaluated. He had known everything about her before they had even met. He had planned it all so meticulously. Julia was so absorbed in the documents that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until the door opened. Richard froze at the sight of her holding the folder. For a moment, shock crossed his face, but he quickly regained his composure. "Julia, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice low but tense. She turned to face him, tears now streaming freely down her cheeks. "I'm finally learning the truth, Richard. You never wanted a wife. You wanted a womb," she exclaimed, throwing the papers onto the bed. Richard closed the door behind him and took a deep breath. "It's not that simple. Not that simple," Julia shouted, her voice shaking with indignation. "Then explain it to me, Richard. Explain how you thought it was acceptable to treat me like an object, a piece of property to use in your plans." Richard took a step forward, but she stepped back. He raised his hands, trying to calm her. "I needed an heir, Julia. I needed to secure the future of my family and my business. It was something I couldn't leave to chance. And you seemed like the right person." "The right person?" Julia laughed bitterly, shaking her head. "You don't even know me. You knew I was desperate, that I had no choice. And you used that against me. You planned everything from the start without even giving me a chance to decide for myself. I never wanted to hurt you, Julia." "Please believe me," Richard said, his voice laced with regret, but Julia didn't want to hear it anymore. "How can I believe someone who's been lying from the beginning? You manipulated everything. You destroyed any chance of trust I might have had in you." Her voice trembled, but she held her ground. Richard ran his hands over his face, visibly frustrated with himself. "You don't understand what's at stake for me. My family, my business, everything depends on this. And you think that justifies what you've done?" Julia snapped, her voice filled with pain and anger. "Nothing justifies lying and deceiving someone like this." Richard tried to step closer, urgency clear in his voice. "Julia, please, give me a chance to explain. We can fix this. I can change things. Just don't leave." She turned to walk away, but he grabbed her arm, his grip firm yet not aggressive. "Julia, please." She looked at him one last time, seeing something in his eyes that seemed human, but it was too late. "You had your chance, Richard. I don't trust you anymore." With those words, she pulled her arm free and left the office, leaving Richard alone with his guilt. He stood there, watching as Julia walked away, her words echoing in the silence. She felt the weight of his betrayal, but knew she had to leave. She couldn't stay in a place where she was treated like something disposable. That night, Julia packed her things. Her mind was a whirlwind as she placed her few belongings into a bag. A part of her still felt connected to Richard, but what he had done was too much to forgive. Before going to bed, she placed a hand on her abdomen, reflecting on the possibility that she might be pregnant. It was a reality she couldn't ignore, but she knew she would have to face it alone. The following morning brought a heavy atmosphere to the mansion. Julia had left before anyone noticed, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He woke early, expecting to find her in the living room or the garden, but her absence was palpable. The housekeeper, Carmen, approached him with a worried expression. "Miss Julia, she's gone," Carmen said hesitantly. "I brought breakfast to her room, but it was empty." Richard was silent for a moment, absorbing the news. Though he had anticipated this after their argument the night before, hearing it out loud hit him harder than he expected. "Thank you, Carmen. That will be all for now," he replied, trying to maintain his composure. Once alone, Richard sat on the sofa, his hands holding his head. The folder Julia had discovered lay on the coffee table, an unavoidable reminder of his choices. He knew his plan had flaws, but he had never considered the emotional impact of his actions. Hours later, Richard was in his office, reviewing documents that now felt meaningless. He couldn't focus. Every page he turned brought him back to the image of Julia, her pain, her anger as she confronted him. He picked up the phone and called the driver who regularly took Julia to appointments. "I need to know where Julia went," he ordered, his voice filled with urgency. "Sir, she didn't request a car. She left on foot with a small bag." The response unsettled him. Julia was alone, with no money or resources, and he couldn't bear to imagine the challenges she might face. Richard hung up the phone and, for the first time in years, felt truly lost. He had everything: money, power, connections, but none of it seemed enough to fix the damage he had caused. Meanwhile, Julia walked the streets of the city, trying to keep her head high. She felt betrayed and hurt, but also determined to move forward. Every step she took felt harder than the last, but she knew she couldn't go back. Spending another night in that mansion, under Richard's control, was unthinkable. She found temporary shelter in a small motel. The place was simple and nearly run down, but it was all she could afford with the little money she had saved. Sitting on the bed, Julia stared at her bag, still processing the events of the past few days. Instinctively, her hand moved to her abdomen, where a mixture of uncertainty and hope began to grow. "Am I pregnant?" The thought haunted her. The symptoms were there: morning nausea, unexplained fatigue. But she wasn't ready to confirm it yet. Not until she could face what it truly meant. Richard spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the growing emptiness in his life. The silence in the house felt louder than ever, with every corner reminding him of Julia. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty, he called Carmen to his office. "I want you to find Julia," he said, handing her an envelope containing money and instructions. "Find out where she is and make sure she's safe." Carmen, though surprised, nodded. She knew Richard well enough to realize this request wasn't just about responsibility. He genuinely cared. "And if she doesn't want to be found," Carmen asked, "then don't push her. Just make sure she has what she needs." As Carmen left to carry out his request, Richard stayed in his office, staring at the phone on his desk. He knew he needed to speak to Julia, but he also knew words wouldn't be enough to fix what had happened. A few days later, Carmen returned with information. Julia was staying at a modest motel in a quieter part of the city. She seemed well, but was avoiding contact with anyone connected to Richard. "She's safe, but it's clear she doesn't want to be found by you," Carmen said, handing him a brief report. Richard held the paper, reading the details. The thought of Julia alone in that place bothered him more than he wanted to admit. "Leave her an anonymous amount," he ordered, still trying to find a way to help her without invading her space. Carmen nodded again, but couldn't resist asking, "Do you plan to tell her the whole truth, or will you let the silence keep growing between you?" Richard didn't respond immediately. He stared at the report in his hands, reflecting on the choices that had led him to this moment. He knew he needed to be honest, but he also knew honesty came with risks. "Not yet," he finally said, "but I will, when the time is right." Julia, meanwhile, was starting to plan her next step. She knew she couldn't stay at the motel forever, but she also didn't want to return to life on the streets. The only thing she was certain of was that she needed to start fresh, far away from Richard and everything he represented. As she packed her bag, she noticed an envelope by the door. Opening it, she found a considerable amount of money. There was no sender, but Julia knew exactly who it was from. "Richard." she murmured, feeling a mix of anger and gratitude. She placed the envelope in her bag and stepped out of the room. It was time to move forward, though she knew the past wouldn't let her go so easily. Days turned into weeks, and Julia's absence continued to weigh on Richard. He spent his nights staring at the folder that had started it all, each page a reminder of the choices that had led him to this point. For the first time, he began to question not just his actions, but who he was and what he truly wanted. Deep down, Richard knew his entire life had been built around control and manipulation. He'd grown up believing that the only way to secure his future was to leave nothing to chance. But Julia had changed that. She had brought something new into his life, something he didn't fully understand: vulnerability. One morning, while reviewing financial reports, Richard felt a wave of frustration. He was surrounded by wealth, but felt emptier than ever. Abruptly, he stood and decided he couldn't continue like this. Something needed to change. Richard began making drastic adjustments to his life. He severed ties with business partners whose ethics he had always despised, even if they were profitable. He canceled contracts reliant on questionable practices and started investing in projects that created social impact. His decisions left his team puzzled, but Richard didn't care. For the first time, he wanted to do something that wasn't purely strategic. As he worked to rebuild his values, he couldn't stop thinking about Julia. He knew no transformation would be complete without repairing what had happened between them. Yet he still didn't know how to approach her without seeming like he was forcing anything. Julia, on the other hand, was trying to rebuild her life. The money Richard had left allowed her to rent a small apartment. It was simple, but to her, it represented a fresh start. She spent her days looking for work while still processing the emotional impact of what she had been through. Despite everything, Julia couldn't completely shake thoughts of Richard. She wondered if he was remorseful, if he had realized how much his actions had hurt her. But at the same time, she knew that trusting him again would be difficult. One afternoon, as she was organizing her things, Julia felt a sudden dizziness. The exhaustion of the past few days felt more intense, and her suspicions grew stronger. With a heavy heart, she decided to walk to a nearby pharmacy and buy a pregnancy test. Sitting on the edge of her bed, she waited for the result, holding her breath. When the confirmation appeared, Julia didn't know how to feel. A mix of joy and fear filled her heart. She was pregnant, and the child was Richard's. She knew this would change everything, but she wasn't ready to decide what to do. Meanwhile, Richard was searching for a way to reconnect with Julia. He knew where she was, but respected her decision to stay away. However, after receiving an update from Carmen about Julia's emotional state, he felt he couldn't wait any longer. "I need to talk to her," he said to himself, organizing his thoughts. He knew that just apologizing wouldn't be enough. He needed to show her that he had changed, that he was ready to let go of control and approach things differently. A few days later, Julia was surprised by a knock at her apartment door. When she opened it, she found Richard standing there, holding a bouquet of flowers. He looked different, less cold, less calculated. "Richard?" she said, surprised but cautious. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," he replied, sincerity evident in his voice. "I know this might not be the best time, but I can't go on without trying to fix things." Julia crossed her arms, maintaining the emotional distance she felt was necessary. "Fix things? Richard, you don't understand how much you hurt me. This isn't something flowers can fix." He nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "I know, and I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness right away. I'm here because I need to tell you the truth. All of it." Julia looked at him, trying to decide if she was ready to listen. Finally, she stepped aside and let him in. They sat in the small living room, and Richard began to speak. "When I made the proposal, I was only thinking about myself. My world has always been about control, about ensuring nothing slips out of my plans. You became part of that plan, and I deeply regret treating you that way." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "But as I spent time with you, I realized I was wrong. Not because the plan failed, but because you showed me something I didn't know I needed, a real connection. You made me see that life isn't just about business and strategies." Julia listened in silence, his words sinking in. It was still hard to trust him, but something in his tone felt genuine. "And what do you expect me to do with this, Richard?" she asked, her voice softer but still cautious. "Nothing," he replied honestly. "I just wanted you to know that I'm changing, that I want to be a better person, not just for me, but for you, and for whatever the future holds." Julia furrowed her brow, sensing the hidden meaning in his words. Did he know? "The future?" she asked, trying to keep calm. Richard looked directly at her, as if trying to read her thoughts. "I know it might be too soon, but I hope that one day you can trust me again, no matter how long it takes." Julia felt tears streaming down her face but maintained her composure. "I need time, Richard. I need to figure out what all this means for me." He nodded, standing up. "I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'll be here when you're ready." Before leaving, he placed the bouquet on the table and looked at her one last time. "Thank you for listening, Julia." She remained silent, watching him leave. When the door closed, Julia sat down and looked at the flowers, trying to process everything that had happened. Something inside her told her that Richard was being truthful, but it was still hard to forget what he had done. She couldn't erase the betrayal, the feeling of being used. And now, with the confirmation of her pregnancy, things had become even more complicated. Let's play a game with those who only read the comments. Type pizza in the comments. Only those who've made it this far will understand. Now let's continue the story. Julia sat on the couch, the bouquet he'd brought still on the table in front of her. The flowers were beautiful, but they couldn't mask the chaos of her emotions. Placing a hand on her abdomen, she felt the weight of the responsibility ahead. She had to think not just of herself, but also of the baby. The next day, Julia decided she needed to seek medical care to confirm her pregnancy and ensure everything was okay. The small clinic she found was simple but welcoming. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, explained the procedure and reassured her. "You're in excellent health, and the baby seems to be developing well," the doctor said, showing her the first ultrasound images. Julia's eyes filled with tears as she saw the tiny flicker on the screen. It made everything real. A new life was growing inside her. Joy and fear mixed in her heart, leaving her even more uncertain about the future. Meanwhile, Richard was struggling to maintain composure amidst the chaos of his thoughts. He had done his best to show Julia he was changing, but he knew it wasn't enough. He needed to give her the space she asked for. But the uncertainty was eating away at him. Determined to do something meaningful, he began finding ways to ensure Julia and the baby had everything they needed, regardless of her response. He discreetly hired a lawyer to set up an account in her name, depositing enough money to cover her expenses for the next several years. He also started researching how to offer her emotional and physical support without pressuring her. But deep down, Richard knew none of this could replace what truly mattered: the desire to be by her side and part of the baby's life. A few days later, Julia was at home when she received an unexpected visit. Carmen stood at the door, holding an envelope and wearing a concerned expression. "Richard asked me to deliver this to you," Carmen said, handing her the envelope. Julia hesitated before accepting it. When she opened it, she found legal documents detailing an account in her name, along with a letter from Richard. "Julia, I want you to know that no matter what you decide, I'll be here to support you and the baby. This account was created to ensure you have everything you need. This is not about control, but an attempt to repair, at least in part, the harm I've caused. I hope this shows that my intentions are now different. Sincerely, Richard." Julia felt a lump in her throat as she finished reading. She didn't know what to think. On one hand, it felt like another attempt by Richard to exert control. On the other hand, she couldn't deny that it seemed like a genuine gesture of concern. "He's really trying, isn't he?" Julia asked Carmen, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Mr. Foster has changed a lot since you left?" Carmen replied with a faint smile. "He's never been this vulnerable before. But I believe he's learning." Julia remained silent, reflecting on the housekeeper's words. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed, thinking about what to do. Finally, she decided she needed to talk to Richard. She didn't know what she would say, but she knew she couldn't keep putting it off. The next morning, she called him. Richard answered almost immediately, his voice filled with surprise and relief. "Julia, is everything okay?" he asked. "Can we meet? I need to talk to you." "Of course, whenever and wherever you want," he replied without hesitation. They agreed to meet at a small cafe in the city center. Julia chose the location because it felt neutral, a place where she could feel more at ease. When she arrived, she found Richard already seated, waiting for her with an anxious expression. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, standing as she sat down. "I'm not here to start over, Richard," she began, her tone firm. "I'm here because we need to talk about the baby." He was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. Although he had suspected this might be the case, hearing the confirmation shook him. "You're pregnant?" he asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Julia nodded. "Yes, and this changes everything." Richard leaned forward, his eyes fixed on hers. "Julia, no matter what happened before, I want to be there. I want to be part of this baby's life, and yours, if you'll allow it." She looked at him, seeing the sincerity in his words, but doubt still lingered in her heart. "I don't know if I can trust you, Richard. You broke that trust, and it's not something that's easily rebuilt." "I understand," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn your trust again. And more than that, I'm committed to being the father this baby deserves." Julia didn't respond immediately. There was something different about Richard, something she couldn't ignore, but she also knew she needed to protect herself and the baby. "Let's take things slow," she said finally. "I can't promise anything, but I'm willing to give you a chance to prove you've really changed." The relief on Richard's face was evident, but he didn't show excessive enthusiasm. He knew he needed to be patient and consistent. "Thank you, Julia. I promise I won't disappoint you." As they said their goodbyes, Julia felt a small glimmer of hope growing in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but she was willing to take it one step at a time. The days following their meeting at the cafe were marked by cautious steps and small gestures of connection. Julia and Richard were united by something bigger than their differences: the new life growing inside her. Although there was still mistrust, Julia could see that Richard was keeping his promise to try. Richard began accompanying Julia to her medical appointments, staying respectfully in the background. He made sure to be punctual, attentive to every detail, and ready to step in if needed. During one of the appointments, as the doctor explained the baby's progress, Richard watched Julia with an expression that combined fascination and regret. "Are you okay?" Julia asked, noticing his gaze. Richard shook his head slightly, as if snapping out of a trance. "I am. It's just incredible, knowing that something so special is happening and that somehow I'm part of it." Julia looked away, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to believe Richard, but the fear of being hurt again still weighed heavily on her heart. After one of the appointments, Richard suggested they have lunch together at a quiet restaurant. Julia hesitated but agreed, feeling it was time to talk about what they both expected from the future. "Julia, I want you to know that I'm not here just because of the baby," he said as they waited for their food. "I'm here because I genuinely want to be part of your life, not because of a contract or any obligation, but because you mean something to me." Julia took a deep breath, processing his words. It was still hard for her to accept that Richard could change so drastically. "It's hard to trust that, Richard. You manipulated me, took advantage of the worst moment of my life to put me in a position I didn't choose. And now, even with everything you're doing, it still feels insufficient." Richard nodded, acknowledging the pain his actions had caused. "I know I made terrible choices, Julia, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show you that I'm a different person now." Julia looked at him, noticing the vulnerability in his voice. It was the first time she'd seen Richard so open, so willing to admit his mistakes. It moved her, even if she didn't want to admit it. As the months passed, Julia's belly grew, and with it, the complexity of her feelings toward Richard. He was present at every moment, helping her prepare the small apartment for the baby's arrival. He never crossed the boundaries she had set, but he also didn't hide his desire to be closer. One evening, as they were organizing baby clothes together, Julia finally decided to break the silence between them. "Why are you so determined to fix everything, Richard?" she asked softly. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. Because, for the first time in my life, I realized that what I truly want can't be bought or planned. You and this baby are the only things that matter to me now. Julia felt a tear escape but quickly wiped it away. And what if I can't trust you again? What if it's never enough? Richard gave a small, sad smile. Then I'll keep trying, Julia. I'll keep trying, even if it takes a lifetime. The moment that most united Julia and Richard came on a quiet evening. Julia was at home when she began to feel a sharp pain. At first, she thought it was something normal, but as the pain intensified, she knew something was wrong. Richard arrived just minutes later, having been called by Carmen, who noticed something was off. He found Julia sitting on the couch trying to hide her concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, kneeling beside her. "I think we need to go to the hospital," Julia said, her voice trembling. Richard didn't waste any time. He grabbed the keys and helped Julia into the car. During the drive, he held her hand, trying to convey calm. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that Julia was in premature labor. Richard's heart raced, but he stayed strong, remaining by her side throughout the process. Hours later, the sound of a baby's cry echoed through the delivery room. Julia held the tiny girl in her arms, tears streaming down her face. Richard, standing beside her, couldn't take his eyes off the scene. "She's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Julia looked at him, seeing something in Richard's eyes she had never seen before, a genuine purity, a joy that couldn't be faked. "Yes, she is," Julia replied, a small smile forming on her lips. In the days that followed, Julia and Rich spent most of their time at the hospital, ensuring the baby received all the necessary care. The closeness they shared during this time brought a new dynamic to their relationship. Julia still had her reservations but began to see Richard in a new light. One evening, as Julia cradled the sleeping baby in her arms, Richard approached with a calm expression. "Have you thought of a name?" he asked. Julia smiled, looking down at her daughter. "I was thinking Lily. What do you think?" Richard nodded, his smile widening. "It's perfect." They sat in silence, watching little Lily. It was a simple moment, yet it held so much meaning. When they finally brought Lily home, Julia knew there was still a long road ahead. She and Richard weren't fully reconciled, but they had taken an important step in the right direction. More than that, they were now a family, and that changed everything. Richard continued to demonstrate his commitment, not just to Lily, but to Julia as well. He knew he still had much to prove, but he was willing to wait as long as it took. And Julia, little by little, began to open her heart to the possibility of a new beginning. Not just because of Lily, but because, despite everything, there was something in Richard she believed she could trust again. The months following Lily's birth were filled with challenges and discoveries for Julia and Richard. They now shared a bond that went beyond contracts and expectations. Each moment with Lily brought them closer, and every smile from their daughter added a bit more light to their lives. Julia still had her doubts, but Richard was dedicated to proving that he was committed to being a different man, a better partner, and above all, a present father. One sunny afternoon, as Lily napped in her crib, Richard found Julia in the garden of their small apartment. She was sitting on a bench, watching the flowers beginning to bloom. "Thinking about something?" he asked, approaching her with a gentle smile. Julia looked at him, her eyes reflecting both doubt and affection. "Thinking about how unpredictable life is. A few months ago, I never imagined I'd be here, with a daughter and with you." Richard sat beside her, keeping a small distance, respecting the space she still needed. "And you?" Julia asked after a moment of silence. "What were you expecting when all this started?" Richard sighed, looking at the flowers. "At first I thought I was in control, that I could plan everything, like I always have. But you showed me that life doesn't work that way. And, to be honest, I don't know if I've ever thanked you for that." Julia gave him a faint smile, surprised by his honesty. "Thanked me for what?" "For showing me that what really matters can't be manipulated, that love and trust are earned, not demanded." Richard's words struck a chord in Julia. She knew he had changed, and slowly, she began to realize that it might be time to let go of the past. As the months passed, Richard continued to dedicate himself to Julia and Lily. He was there for every milestone, from Lily's first smile to her early attempts at crawling. Julia, in turn, began allowing him to get closer. There were still scars, but time and Richard's actions were helping to heal them. One evening, while Lily was sleeping soundly, Richard invited Julia to dinner. He took her to a small restaurant he had discovered, intimate and cozy, perfect for a quiet conversation. "This place is beautiful," Julia said, admiring the candles lighting the room. "I thought it suited you," Richard replied, smiling. During dinner, they reminisced about the tumultuous early days of their relationship, laughing at situations that had once seemed insurmountable. At one point, in a moment of vulnerability, Richard reached for Julia's hand. "I know I've made so many mistakes, Julia, and I know I may never fully make up for what I did. But I want you to know that I love you, not because of Lily or any plan. I love you for who you are, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you that." Julia was silent for a few moments, his words echoing in her heart. She knew he was being sincere. For the first time, she felt she could completely trust Richard. "I love you too," she replied, a gentle smile spreading across her face. Richard seemed unable to contain his emotion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple yet elegant ring. "Julia, I know this is fast, but I want you to know I'm ready for a new beginning. Will you marry me again? This time, no contracts or hidden agendas. Just us, building a life together." Julia felt tears streaming down her face, but this time, they were tears of joy. "Yes, Richard, I want to marry you." The ceremony was simple, with only a few guests. Lily, dressed as a little flower girl, was the star of the event, bringing smiles to everyone as Richard and Julia exchanged heartfelt vows. This time, there were no secrets, only a promise of love and partnership. Richard looked into Julia's eyes as he held her hands. "I promise to love you, respect you, and be the man you deserve every day of my life." Julia smiled, holding back her tears. "And I promise to trust you, support you, and walk by your side, no matter what lies ahead." When they said, "I do," the applause was drowned out by the overwhelming emotion that filled the air. Julia and Richard sealed the moment with a kiss, a gesture full of hope and love. After the ceremony, Richard surprised Julia. He had completely renovated the mansion, transforming it into a warm and inviting home full of life. The garden, now blooming with flowers Julia had chosen, became the heart of the place. "Welcome to our home," Richard said, holding her hand as they walked through the entrance together. Julia looked around, feeling a mix of gratitude and happiness. She knew this wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of everything they had overcome. The days that followed were filled with joy. Lily grew up surrounded by love, and Julia and Richard found the perfect rhythm as a family. They still faced challenges, but now they tackled them together, with trust and love. One afternoon, while playing with Lily in the garden, Richard looked at Julia and took her hand. "I never thought I could be this happy," he said. Julia smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And I never thought I could trust you again. But you proved you were willing to change, and I'm grateful for that every day." Richard kissed her softly as Lily giggled, trying to reach the flowers around her. What started as a relationship marked by manipulation and mistrust had transformed into something pure and genuine. Richard and Julia, united by Lily, found the happy ending they both deserved. Do you think Julia made the right choice in forgiving Richard? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to follow all our stories. And check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.